Hello, so this is a presentation about a different approach I've been taking this week for the mosaic scan mode. For a while I was sort of banging my head against the wall trying to use the geophysics measurements to model what the KUKA radar actually saw in terms of the backscatter signature. But now I'm trying to take a different approach where I'm saying, hey, actually there's loads of information contained in the backscatter, why don't we use that to try and model the geophysics that were observed. So smrt is a forward model for backscatter, so it takes in the geophysics and it models the Ku and Ka band co and cross pole backscatter at different angles. And because there's uncertainty in the geophysical parameters, sometimes quite a lot, sometimes they weren't even measured, there's a lot of uncertainty in the backscatter, so much that it makes actually modelling the backscatter that was observed really difficult, arguably impossible. And that's because the observed backscatter is really specific and information rich, and we just can't be that precise with the inputs to the model. And that's not just like observational uncertainty, but if you're using a simple model like one layer for snow, then you need to like condense loads of SMP measurements down into an effective correlation length. So there's also like more subtle uncertainties than just the density cutter is plus or minus 50 kilograms per centimeter cubed. So yeah, why don't we turn this on its head and mess around with smrt essentially until we exactly or as exactly as possible get the backscatter signature that we saw back from the model. And that's surprisingly difficult, and that's actually good, because we'd be in a mess if it was really easy to simulate the observations, if it was a many inputs to one output problem. But in fact, actually, it's so difficult to simulate the backscatter accurately that when you do, you can be arguably, I'd say, pretty confident that you've got the right geophysical parameters. So let's just investigate this a bit more. When I say messing around with smrt, we need to mess around with it in a systematic way. So we tweak the input parameters to change the output to match the observations, and we can do that with a couple of different strategies. But ideally, we would get feedback. So we'd notice that the agreement is getting better and better, and we continue doing the thing that makes it better until the agreement is optimized. And initially I was just doing that with interactive sliders. So I would just play with like the snow height or the salinity height, and I would look at the agreement between the output and the input. And you can see here, to actually objectively assess the agreement, you need to define a cost function. And you can see the cost function represented in grey in that moving image. So you can see that as I tweak the parameters, the cost that's represented numerically in the top right changes based on the agreement between the output and the input. But this is really hard because there are like 10 input parameters that you can see there on the sliders, and they all interact quite differently. So they when you fiddle with one, its behavior is based on the state of all of the other parameters, or if not all, many of the other parameters. So just doing it by eye manually isn't great. What we'd really like to do is we need to find a systematic way of minimizing the cost function with like maths and science. So we'd like to find the minimum of a function. So here's a schematic representation of that cost function, imagining we've just got 2 degrees of freedom, we've just got 2 sliders. So you can see that here maybe the cost function would be a surface that's got some different minima, and the global minimum, the lowest possible value of the cost function, that represents the best fit that we can do. So here the minimum is actually when the ice salinity and the snow depth are both 3, then the cost function is minimized. And what I've done to make this is that I've sort of imagined that I can calculate the cost function for every single combination of snow depth and ice salinity. And you can do that with 2 degrees of freedom, just depth and salinity. That's quite easy. This isn't the actual function you get from SMRT, but it's just a visually easy to understand one. And we can't do that with 10 different parameters, not just because it's like a 10-dimensional surface that we can't visualize as human beings, but also because it's computationally exhausting. So the space, the parameter space you can see in this visualization is 10 by 10. So it's got 100, like a size of 100. Whereas when you have 10 different dimensions, so snow depth, snow temperature, ice salinity, ice thickness, ice correlation length, all of that, if the reasonable range of parameters could be 10 for each, then it's 10 by 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 10. So it's a really massive space to explore. And you can't just plot out the cost function, not just because you can't visualize it, but just because it's too big. You can't possibly find the minimum just by trying and calculating it for every possible thing and finding the minimum value. So we need to have an algorithm that finds the minimum a bit more cleverly. So to do that, we use something called gradient descent. And what you can think of that is, if you're in a landscape and maybe you're blind so you can't see, you're just to find the lowest point on the landscape, you could try just going down, so you can feel which way is down with your feet, and you could just walk down and keep walking down the steepest gradient you can find until you can't go down anymore, and we call that your local minimum. So you can see from all the different starting places what happens on this surface if our little guys, our little squares and triangles, just walk down, and they always find a local minimum. And the triangles, they're kind of lucky that where they start, they find the global minimum, the lowest possible point on the surface. But the squares are a little bit less lucky. They do find a local minimum, but it's not the global minimum. So that represents a point where the model and the observations agree well, but that's not the best agreement. That's not the geophysical parameters that are most likely to produce the observed backscatter. That's the one represented by the hole that the triangles go into. So that's a gradient descent function for finding a local minimum in the cost function. Sorry, a gradient descent algorithm that finds the local minimum. And for our 10-dimensional SMRT parameter space, there are loads of these local minima, absolutely loads. So we can't just take a guess and hope that we find the global one. This gradient descent function isn't that good. What we need is an algorithm to find the global minimum. So a global minimum algorithm, you'd take a good guess, go into a local minimum, and then you perturb your state, and there's some different schemes to perturb it, and you would hop from one basin into another. And that actually sounds really complicated, but it's a bit like just taking a new initial guess. And you take your new initial guess based on some information that you've already got, rather than just randomly taking it. And you keep taking those initial guesses and looking at the depth of the minimum that you find until you give up, basically, until you meet some kind of condition. We could say that is maybe our cost function is below 2, and that's when we're satisfied that the model is representing. The model is reproducing the observations so well that we're like, yes, okay, these are the geophysical parameters that produce that backscatter signature. So that's what I've done. I've sort of presented this inverse model with the first backscatter profile in a time series, and then the code finds the global minimum. And actually then it gets a lot easier, because as the backscatter profile evolves, the cost function evolves, that yellow-purple surface evolves, but it evolves quite slowly, so you can keep track of the location of the global minimum just by doing a local minimization algorithm. So you can just so if the cost function changes, you can track the global minimum just by doing gradient descent. And that's really computationally cheap. We don't have to do all this basin hopping stuff. And as we track the evolution of the cost function, that's driven by evolution of the backscatter profile, we can hopefully plot out the time evolution of the geophysical parameters. So you can see here that the backscatter profile is evolving in time, making the cost function evolve in time. And if we track the minimum of the cost function, we can basically draw out a graph of how, in this case, I've picked them at random, snow temperature and ice salinity evolve in time. And this is just a schematic. This is like obviously oversimplified. It doesn't go around in circles like this. But I just did it to demonstrate the concept of what I'm pursuing. So actually doing the basin hopping algorithm in like the full 10-dimensional parameter space is really computationally expensive. So I'm currently working on hooking up the code to the UCL high performance computing facilities, where I'm going to run it overnight and hopefully get back some good fits for the global minima corresponding to the beginning of each of the KUKA backscatter time series. So once I've done that, the algorithm will be running like this, where we can tweak the input parameters until we can back out the geophysics from the backscatter profile.